Virtual machine deployment can be sometimes annoying if you just want to quickly create a new VM for your development environment or for testing stuff. And I came across this software because I often need to create new VMs when I make YouTube tutorials or also develop stuff. And I don't want to run through that whole installation and configuration process over and over again, because you need to download your ISO file, you need to create a new VM on your hypervisor, then you will need to configure it, boot up the system and do the whole installation process every time. And this process can be fully and easily automated with an open source tool that is called Vagrant. So that is pretty easy if you just want to create a fresh VM setup for your development or testing stuff. And I think this is a very useful tool for everyone who just wants to automate the creation and provisioning process of virtual machines. If you want to know how to do that, keep watching. Let me first explain to you what Vagrant is. Vagrant is an open source software that is developed by HashiCorp and that is mainly targeted for developers, DevOps and also designers who just wants to easily create and automate the provisioning process of virtual machines on their desktop computers. So that usually would integrate with common hypervisors like Microsoft Hyper-V, VirtualBox or also Docker. And that can run on almost all operating systems. You can run it on Windows, on macOS and also on Linux. It usually integrates with a hypervisor interface through a provider, and this provider communicates to the Hyper-V to create, start, stop those virtual machines. It is also highly customizable as you can program your own custom providers. So you could also use that in cloud environments. There are custom providers for Google Cloud, Azure, AWS and so on. It uses simple configuration files. These are called Vagrant files, where you can just configure or use templates to create your virtual machines. And then you simply run the Vagrant command from the console and it will automatically create a VM on your hypervisor, set the configuration and install the machine. It uses images that are called boxes, and you can explore a variety of different boxes on the HashiCorp homepage. So you will find a lot of boxes for Linux distributions like Ubuntu, Debian, CentOS and so on, but you could also find boxes for Windows 10 or also Windows servers. So you can also build your own custom boxes if you want to do that. You can use that in many different setups, and I think this is just a nice and great tool to set up your own virtual development or testing environment. If you want to install Vagrant on your computer, you simply just go to the homepage vagrantapp.com, then go to download, select your operating system and just download and install the software. Note that you should already have installed your hypervisor before you do that. By default, Vagrant integrates automatically with VirtualBox, and that is the default provider. So if you are running Vagrant on Windows 10 with Microsoft Hyper-V, I also strongly recommend you to have a look at this page, where you will find lots of tips and tricks documented by Microsoft that will help you to properly configure and run Vagrant on Windows 10 with a Microsoft Hyper-V. So I've done that in my test setup and it works very well. Let's start with some basic examples and let's create our first virtual machine with Vagrant. To do that, we will need to create a new Vagrant file and place all the configuration stuff in there. I strongly recommend you to create a new folder where you place this Vagrant file, because all the virtual disks, the configuration things are stored in this location. So you should use a location where you have enough disk space to store those virtual hard disks. So if you have created a new folder, you can simply just type Vagrant in it. It will automatically create a template or a test file you can just easily customize, and there are some pre-configured configuration settings you can just comment out. So let's open the Vagrant file with our favorite text editor. In my case, this is a Vim text editor, and just have a look at this configuration file. And you can see the Vagrant file starts with some comments that define the basic structure of this file, and that will help you to configure that file appropriately. The first statement is the vagrant.configure2do statement, and that will describe in which version this Vagrant file is configured. So this is always backwards compatible to version 1, but the current version is the version 2, and that is what we are also using in this tutorial. The config variable defines a variable that is later used as a prefix to set those different configuration settings below the do statement. You can see it here at this point. The config.vm.box equal statement will set the box image to the base, and that is basically just a placeholder. We will replace that with a basic Ubuntu Linux distribution. So we will use a generic image, a box from HashiCorp that is called the Bionic 64. That is in Ubuntu 18.04 LTS in 64-bit, and that is used as our box image, and that can be easily used for testing purposes. If you scroll below, you can see there are some network configuration settings, and the first thing we will do is we will comment out this line here, the config VM network public network. So this is very important because you want Vagrant to create a virtual machine that is connected to your bridged physical network. So if you want to get internet access and you want to get an IP address of your home network, for example, you would need to comment out this line here. And if you're running VirtualBox as your hypervisor, that would just be fine. So you could just now start the virtual machine. If you want to set up provider-specific configuration settings, you can scroll below, and there you can see a section, example for VirtualBox, where there is a config VM provider statement for VirtualBox. There you can set some provider-specific configuration settings, like the memory that is allocated by the VM and so on. So those provider-specific configuration settings, they only apply to a specific provider, so that depends on what hypervisor you are running on your computer. If you're running VirtualBox, you can just comment out these lines and make some changes there. But in my case, I'm using HyperV on Windows 10. So this only applies to VirtualBox. So when we want to change our provider, we will need to do some adjustments here. The first thing we need to do is we need to comment out this line here, because Vagrant is creating some synchronized folders that will share some files between the virtual machine and your host operating system. In HyperV, it is recommended to change this line as this here and add a disabled statement at the end. Why? Because Vagrant by default is using the SMB in version 1 protocol, and that is disabled on Windows 10 because of security reasons. SMB v1 is not secured anymore, and I don't recommend you to use it or enable it. You could in theory do that to make Vagrant available of these synchronized folders, but if you can live without these synchronized folders as I can do, I would just recommend you guys to skip this and disable this setting. Then we will need to change our provider. So I will type the config.vm.provider and set this to HyperV, because otherwise Vagrant would try to boot up this virtual machine with VirtualBox. And then I also want to set some provider-specific configurations, and this is recommended by Microsoft. So just type in config.vm.provider hyperv do, and then we will use a variable h that is used as a prefix below the do statements. Just enter h dot and then enable virtualization underscore extensions. So in my case, I need to set this to false, and this is because I'm using an AMD processor, and enabling these virtualization extensions would also enable nested virtualization. That is not supported on AMD processors on Windows 10 in the current version, so I need to disable this, otherwise I would get an error. The next setting that is recommended to turn on is the linked clone setting. So type in h.linked clone and set this to true. So this will extremely improve the creation and provisioning process of any virtual machine when running HyperV on Windows 10. Don't forget to place an end at the do statement, and then we can simply write the changes to this file and start the machine. To start a virtual machine, just type in Vagrant up. So that will tell Vagrant to create this virtual machine at your hypervisor, automatically install it, boot up and provision this machine. You can see it's now creating this virtual machine at your hypervisor, import this VM and then start the provisioning process. Now Vagrant wants me to select a virtual switch that will now connect the virtual machine to the network. To select the virtual switch, I will now need to enter an existing one. To see how you can create those switches, just open the HyperV manager, and you can see there's a new virtual machine that is just created. It's in the off statement, so that is because Vagrant has not finished the configuration process. Just go to Virtual Switch Manager on the right side, and then you will have different network switches. You could also create new ones. In my case, I've already created a virtual switch that is called Bridge, and that is connected to my physical network card. So this allows me to share the same network card with the operating system and all virtual machines that are connected to this virtual switch. In this case, the virtual machine gets an IP address in the same range like my desktop operating system, and I can easily access it or access the internet from the virtual machine. Now let's enter the number 1 for the bridge interface and just hit enter. Vagrant will now configure the virtual machine, start it, boot it up and start the provisioning process. If you open the HyperV manager, you can also see it creates a new Ubuntu test server _default_ and then randomly generated number. It also has assigned 1 gig of memory, so Vagrant has some kind of default entries that define what name and what assigned memory, what CPU cores and so on should be configured. But you could also change those settings in provider-specific configurations. I will show you in a second how you would do that. Let's just go back to our console and wait until the machine is booted up. If you're doing this the first time, Vagrant should also download the box image and also should ask you to create a new private key that is used for the authentication. Just confirm that and continue with this tutorial. And the machine is now booted and ready. We can now access the machine via SSH from the console. Just type in Vagrant SSH and it will automatically launch a shell and connect via the private key to your virtual machine. You don't need to enter any username or password, it will just work out of the box. And we can now start configuring our virtual machine, install any software and use this in our development setup. Okay, so let's go back to our main console and let's start to change some of these provider specific configurations. If we want to know what settings are available there, we will need to open the Vagrant homepage, go to the provider documentation and see what provider custom settings are available there. If you are on the homepage, just go to Docs and that will open the documentation, scroll down to providers and then you will select your provider. So if you are running VirtualBox, then select this here and you can have a look at all these configuration settings and then you will get a list of what's possible here. In my case, I'm using the HyperV provider, so I will open this here and go to the configuration and there are some configuration settings I can just change. So that CPU settings, for example, can change the number of virtual CPUs allocated to the VM. You can also change other things here like snapshot, checkpoints and so on. But in my case, I just want to change the memory that is used by this machine and also the VM name, because I don't want this randomly generated number at the end. So let's go back to our Vagrant file and do those configuration changes. So we just enter some new lines here. In this case, I will place an h.memory is equal 2048. So that stands for 2 gigabytes of memory. And I will also change the h.vm name equal Ubuntu test server 1. Okay. We can simply write this file, and if you have made changes to this configuration file, you will need to use a second command that is Vagrant reload. So that will make Vagrant to stop the virtual machine, apply those configuration changes and start it again. The machine is now rebooted and ready again. Let's open the VM manager and you can see the name has changed to Ubuntu test server 1 and also the assigned memory has changed to 2 gigs of memory. So this is how you could easily change those configuration files and how you could easily adjust those provider specific settings. Let me also show you how you can explore the different boxes, because as I said at the beginning, you could set up Ubuntu servers, you could set up different Linux distributions, but also Windows 10 and Windows servers. So if you want to know what boxes are available, just go to the Vagrant homepage and click on Find Boxes. And then you will find a complete list of all created images. Some of these are created by the community, some of them are created by HashiCorp. Don't forget to check your provider, because there are some boxes that are only available on VirtualBox or on some other providers, so you can use that as a filter. And if you're running HyperV, for example, it's highly recommended that you only use images on HyperV, because otherwise your virtual machine wouldn't run properly. Then you can type in the name or search for specific operating systems or specific architecture, software, and so on. So there are some images that are already pre-installed with some applications that could be useful. You can see there are CentOS boxes, Ubuntu boxes, and different stuff here as well, also Debian stuff. But you could also search for Windows Server, for example. So you can see there are some guys that already have created images for Windows servers, Windows with Docker images, and everything else. So let's search for an Ubuntu 20.0 for LTS image. And I found this image here. This is working very well on the HyperV. So if you want to see some details of the image, you can click on it, and then you will see some configuration templates and also some recommendations and release notes. So how it should work and what is done in this box image. So we will use this here, and let me show you how to create a new Vagrant file with using this as a box image. If you want to know how to manage those boxes that are automatically downloaded on your computer, you can enter the command vagrant box list. So that will list all boxes that are currently downloaded. You can see this is this HashiCorp Bionic 64 we have just used, and I also have done some tests with the Windows 10 box. So you can also remove boxes with vagrant box remove and then the name, to clear up your system and delete those boxes you don't need anymore. So let's try to use that box we have just found, that generic Ubuntu 2004, and let's create a new folder that is called Ubuntu Test Server 2. And we will go into that folder, and we could now initialize a new Vagrant file, but we will just copy the file from our previous folder and make some changes to that. So we'll use a Vagrant file and copy this to the current folder. Let's open the configuration file and make some changes. So we first need to change the configured box, because we are now want to use that generic Ubuntu 2004 image. And then we will also need to change the name of the virtual machine, because otherwise this would not be possible, or it would just add some randomly generated numbers at the end, because we already have an Ubuntu Test Server 1, so we will use Ubuntu Test Server 2. We could also make some other changes, but for now I will just want to boot this machine. So let's write this file and just type in vagrant up. So this will now download the new image file, because I haven't used this before. So we need to wait until this is downloaded, and it will automatically store that box on our computer, create the virtual machine and install that. The machine is now booted up and ready. If you want to check what virtual machines are currently run with Vagrant, simply type in vagrant global status. And that will get you a list of all virtual machines that are currently running. So you can see this Ubuntu Test Server 2 and this Ubuntu Test Server. If you want to delete one of these virtual machines, you simply go to the directory. So let's go to Ubuntu Test Server and then simply type in vagrant destroy. So this will automatically stop the virtual machine, delete it from the HyperV configuration and delete those image files. So let's confirm this. Let's run this vagrant global status again to see if the machine was deleted. But you can see the entry is still there. So this is because the data is cached and may not be completely up to date, so as it is mentioned here. We can use this command here, the global status --prune, to prune any invalid entries, so that will refresh everything. And after this is done, you should see there's only one machine left. So this is currently running on our Ubuntu Test Server 2. We can also verify this in the HyperV backend. So this was just a quick introduction to Vagrant. I know there's a lot more stuff you can cover. As I said, it can also be used in automated scripting stuff. So if you have Ansible or Puppet and you want to connect that, this is possible. You could also write custom shell or PowerShell script that are automatically executed once the virtual machine is provisioned. So if you want to see me doing more of these tutorials, especially with automated stuff and scripting stuff with Vagrant, just leave me a comment in the description below if you would be interested in this kind of content. And also, if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit the like button so I know this is valuable to you. And if you haven't already done that, don't forget to subscribe to my channel if you want to know how to really become an IT professional. So thanks everybody for watching, enjoy the rest of your day, take care of yourself, and I see you soon.